Hi YouTube fam, welcome to Talking Crime. My name is Gina Marie and this is where I like to come to talk about solved and unsolved true crime cases, true crime facts and stats, and missing person cases that I don't feel have gotten enough attention from mainstream media. If you're interested in everything true crime, then you have most definitely come to the right place. I do hope that you will choose to subscribe to this channel, and if you press that little bell next to the subscribe button, YouTube will notify you whenever I upload new content. Quick warning before we get started, my videos are not intended for children, nor are they suitable for children. They're also not suitable for those who are easily triggered or offended. I talk about true crimes here, and so the stories that I tell, the photos that I show, and the language that I use tend to be graphic in nature, so viewers' discretion is most definitely advised. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about Henry Landru of France. He was a balding, short, scrawny little sad excuse of a man. He had a thick, overgrown mustache that matched his ridiculously long and untamed eyebrows. He had an ego the size of Texas. He thought he was way too valuable to be working a regular 9 to 5 type job or really working at all. Really, if he had any money or anything of value, you could bet your ass that he stole that shit from somebody. In case I wasn't clear earlier, I don't think he was in any way an attractive guy, nor do I like a damn thing about him. What he was a career criminal, a con artist who preyed on lonely, naive women during World War I, who were either lonely because their husbands were off fighting the war or they were widowed already. He started off doing petty crimes, and over time, his crimes became more planned out, more elaborate, and more violent. He became a serial killer. He was charged and convicted of murdering 11 women and one teenage boy who was the son of one of his 11 female victims. But he was thought to have murdered way, way more, and they just couldn't prove it. He conned people that he met in person in the bars at first, but then his MO became luring in his victims through personal newspaper ads. He used fake names and he lied about pretty much every aspect of his life. Then he would establish romantic relationships with people who responded to his ads. He built trust. Eventually, he would steal everything he could from each one of the people that answered his ads. He'd steal their jewelry, their homes, their life savings, and even their lives. Mr. Julian Alexander Sylvain Landru was born in 1835, and Miss Marie Antoinette Fleur Henriquel, I hope I said that correctly, was born in 1836, and both were born in France. The two met and began dating in their late teens, and it wasn't long before she became pregnant. Now, in those days, getting knocked up out of wedlock was super shameful and scandalous. People started treating them differently as soon as word got out. They heard the whispers and knew the people talked behind their backs, but they really didn't try to hide it much. They really just didn't care what people thought about them. Their daughter, who they named Florentine Marguerite Landru, was born on January 2nd, 1854, and they loved her. But both had really been hoping that their baby was going to be a son. They didn't have the ultrasounds back then. It's kind of, you waited till the baby was born to find out, and they were so sure it was going to be a boy, and then it wasn't. It was a daughter, and as much as they loved her, they really wanted a son. So, for 10 years after their daughter was born, they were trying to get pregnant again in the hopes that the second baby was going to go ahead and be a boy, the son that they dreamed of having. But during that 10 years, she just couldn't get pregnant. So they decided to get married 1 month after their daughter turned 10 years old, and they continued to try to have, a second child over the next 4 years, and during that time they suffered the heartbreak that comes along with having 2 miscarriages. They finally gave up on the idea of having another baby. They came to the conclusion that having a son just wasn't in the cards for them, and so they stopped trying, and then, boom, she was surprised to find out she was pregnant yet again. They didn't want to get their hopes up at first. They were scared that this pregnancy was going to end in miscarriage, just like the others, but as time went on, there was no miscarriage. They finally let themselves get excited about having another child. And when April 12th, 1869 rolled around, they were extremely relieved and beaming with pride when the baby was born, and it was a boy. So they named their son Henry Desiree Landru. Desiree means much desired in French. Now, the struggles weren't over for this family, though, not by a long shot. They now had both a teenage daughter and an infant son to care for. Financially, they were a pretty poor family, and that wasn't due to a lack of trying. Henry's parents both had decent jobs. They worked long hours, and they alternated taking care of the kids. And then they also had their daughter take care of their son when neither of them could be around. Back then, 10-year-olds had a lot more leeway. I don't know if leeway is the right word. They were given a lot more responsibility than maybe some are these days. These days, CPS would be on your doorstep right now if you had a 10-year-old babysitting infant, But back then, this was not unheard of. So, anyways, they both parents worked, and sleep. What's that? They were used to working really hard, and it's kind of too bad that that trait wasn't passed down to their son Henry. But I digress. His parents were hardworking, honest, God-fearing people. His father was a salesman and also a driver. His mother was a dressmaker, plus raising two kids, but they made it work. They still didn't have enough money to live the way they wanted to, but they got by. Little Henry went to a school that was run by monks as soon as he was old enough to go to school. It's said that he displayed a very sharp mind. He was intelligent. He was expected to go very far in life, accomplish much. For years, Henry regularly sang in their church choir. The church was located right across the street from his school. His parents attended this church regularly, and he was also an altar boy for the church. And then, what seemed like suddenly, after years of this, his whole attitude changed, his behaviors and priorities all changed. Just did a 180. He quit school, and he went to work in an architect's office as like a little helper, errand boy, whatever. He was in his teens. Soon afterwards, he met a Marie Catherine who worked as an assistant for the laundress that his parents took their clothes to. And he lied to impress her, and instead of saying that he worked for an architect, he said he was the architect, and apparently that lie worked because, like his parents before him, he knocked her up well before a wedding. And then he ran off into the military. So he completed 3 years of service with the French military. And then he came home. And soon after he came back, he got back with his girlfriend who had his first child. And she became almost immediately pregnant with their second child. Then he married her. He married Marie. And he did that right. She was pregnant with their second child. Right before the second child was born, he married her. And altogether, they had a total of 4 children. Marie was thought to be a very sweet young lady, but very naive and trusting. She pretty much believed everything he told her for the first quite a few years that they were together. But he didn't. He wouldn't have known the truth if it bit him on the ass. So it took her quite a while to figure that one out. But she was hoping that he would be more of a father to his children, and husband like his father was, Henry's father, because he was a responsible man. He was an honest man. He was a good husband, faithful as far as anybody has written or that I've read. Worked hard and did his best. And she was kind of hoping that her husband, Henry, would be just like his dad. But turns out he was very little, if anything, like his father. And he did manage to get a couple side jobs here and there. He ended up, when he came back from the military, he wasn't working for the architect anymore. So he had learned how to do some shady shit while he was in the military. And when he got back, he pretty much expanded on that. The petty crimes that he started out doing were done in these little side jobs that he was taking. Most of the jobs that he took were shady at best, and he was making more money off of doing petty crime than off of a honest income. He never brought home enough money to make ends meet, let alone feed their children enough or pay bills pretty much anything. He would spend most of it before he even bothered bringing the money home. So his wife, Marie, did continue working as a laundress, worked doing laundry as a laundress assistant, and she was raising the kids pretty much on her own. He was hardly ever around. And as time went on, he became more and more dishonest. His crimes got more brazen. He was picked up by the cops on multiple occasions. He did like a year here, some months there, but for the most part, he wasn't punished too harshly because the courts were under the impression that he was insane. They believed that he suffered from diminished capacity and that he could not be held responsible for his actions. So I guess he conned them too. And don't get me wrong, he was fucked up in the head, but he knew what he was doing. And he had gotten pretty good at it. He started making friends with like-minded petty criminals, many of which he met when he was doing these little stints of time for the petty crimes that he was picked up for. And then he'd hook back up with them on the outs. He was known to have a lot of flings with random women. He came up with what he thought was a genius plan. He needed to stop giving up his goods for free, so to speak. So why have meaningless sex with random women and have nothing to show for it besides maybe a penicillin prescription? Just kidding. Sort of. World War One was no longer thought of by him as anything other than a way to make more money. And he hoped that the war would last for a really long time. Why? Because, well, all the soldiers were away at war, and it left all their little lonely, mindless women behind as far as he was concerned. He didn't think women had any kind of brains, and he thought that as long as the men were away, he would be able to make his living off of the women that were left behind, like a prize for him, you know. He started off meeting them in bars, like I alluded to earlier, and the quality of woman wasn't exactly what he was looking for. He was finding women that were pretty much in the same boat he was in, broke, except for a couple bucks to have a beer, looking for a fling, hoping to get some money off of the person they get a fling with. Well, if they were trying to get anything out of him, they were sorely disappointed because he had nothing. So he was wanting a higher class, financial class of female to try to con out of money. So he decided he was going to start placing personal ads in the local paper. Each one was a little different, but all of them had fake names he used for himself and would say that he was a widower who was well off, who was looking for another widower who wanted to get married. He was lonely, whatever. He needed a woman in the home to make it more homey. And his little bullshit stories conned in, roped in quite a few. Now there's a Jeannie Cutchett, and she had a son who was a teenager, and his name was Andre. And she answered one of the ads that Henry had put in the newspaper, one of the personal ads. And she fell head over heels for Henry, and he moved in with them, and they did bounce around a little bit, but her family, she introduced her sister and brother-in-law, excuse me, to Henry, and they just got a bad vibe off of him. They told her in no uncertain terms that she needed to stop seeing him or they were cutting her off. They didn't want nothing to do with her. They couldn't stand him. And they tried to tell her that she was being scammed, conned, whatever, and she didn't want to believe it, but she also didn't want to lose her family. So and she was engaged to Henry at this point, and she broke it off with him and told them about it, so they were relieved. But then in late August of 1914, she reconciled with Henry and the engagement was back on, but she kept insisting to her sister and brother-in-law that the engagement was over and they weren't going to see each other anymore, even though he was pretty much living with her again. And then they ended up moving from place to place with him. It was a volatile relationship. There was a lot of distrust, but every time she caught him in a lie, he managed to bullshit and fast talk enough for her to second guess herself and let it go. Her son was a little young to join the army, but he was eager, very patriotic, wanting to join the military. She wasn't having none of that. And so she was very focused on keeping her son home rather than focusing on the bullshit stories that Henry was giving her about this, that, and the other. So a lot of it slipped past her radar. Her son was just so eager. He wanted to go fight the Germans. He was too young to volunteer. But then he did have a little side job, and she was afraid that he was just going to take off and enlist. And so one day, she just pulled him right out of his job in northwest Paris, France, and her last name, Cutchet, that is actually was not her real name. That was the last name that Henry told her his name was, and it was not. But he was going by Monsieur. I don't speak French, so please forgive me if I just completely destroy the words, but Monsieur Cuchit. And then, so she and her fiance, or at this point, she believes she's married to him, but it's not even his name, so it's not a legal marriage, but she didn't know that. So her husband, Monsieur Cuchit, and her son, Andre, moved to a house in, here we go again, I'm going to run this, Vernouillet, I'm not sure. It's Vernquillet. So if you know how to pronounce that, I would love to know, because I tried Googling it and it would not register to tell me. Usually Google will be very good about pronouncing words for me, but this one I couldn't get it to. So I guess it's a small town by the Seine, 35 kilometers northwest of Paris. Okay, over Christmas time, Cutchet she wrote to a female friend of hers that explained why they should not come down and visit for the holidays. In mid-January, Andre learned to his joy that his scheduled recruitment that he had to the army had been brought forward 2 years to December of 1915. He wrote his friend that was in the army on January 20th, letting him know the good news. And he wrote to an uncle a week later, but then nobody ever heard from Jeannie and Andre again, ever. They just were never heard from again. They just disappeared without a trace. Nobody's ever seen him again. And it turned out that Henry believed that Jeannie knew or was catching on to the fact that he was not who he said he was, and that he was pretty much a fake, a fraud, and he wasn't going to be arrested. He was not having it. So they disappeared. And Landru's 9 known victims after Jeannie and Andre all lived in Paris. I'm going to list off their names and what I could find about them, which isn't much, unfortunately. Not only was this a long time ago and in another country, but just very little I could find on each of them. But I still want his victims to be named. I don't like giving all this information about the asshole who did it and not being able to tell about the people who suffered at his hands. So, in order of the presumed date that they were murdered, um, here we go. Here, let's see. Okay. Celeste, Buisson, Buisson, 47 years old. They believe that she was murdered September 1917. She was described as homely, trusting, and only semi-literate. Celeste was yet another woman who answered the Lonely Hearts advertisement in the newspaper. She was born in southwest France. She was a widow who worked as a housekeeper and was lonely after the mobilization of her only son, who was illegitimate. Landru used the alias Georges Fremiet, and he became engaged to Celestine. Anyways, he became engaged to her almost immediately. But then he put off their marriage for more than 2 years, pleading lost identity documents, long business trips while he was out doing what he does with other people. And then she disappeared. Louise, Jaume. Louise Jamie, 38 years old, is believed to have been murdered in November 1917. She was a devout Catholic. She worked as a dress shop assistant who answered the Lonely Hearts advertisement that Landru placed in a conservative newspaper after decided to divorce her estranged husband. She initially refused to sleep with Landru. Landru's alias at that time was Lucien Gullet. He was supposedly a refugee from the German-occupied Ardennes region, and he broke her resistance, so to speak, and got her to sleep with him, and then took her to Gambia's on a one-way train ticket after celebrating Mass with her, and then she was never to be seen again. Anne Marie, or Annette Pascal, was 37 in Gambes. She's thought to have been murdered April of 1918. On account of her wide-brimmed hat, Annette Pascal was nicknamed Madame Sombrero by her neighbors on the street near the cemetery that she lived and worked making dresses for a Paris fashion house. Pascal was divorced and childless following the death of her only son in infancy and was looking for a so-called sugar daddy. In September 1916, when she spotted Landru's Lonely Hearts ad, they got together. He found out that she was not rich. She was never seen again. Marie Therese Marchandier, 37 years old, Gambias, thought to have been murdered in January of 1919. She was born in Bordeaux, France. Marie Therese Marchandier was a career prostitute. She was a familiar sight on the street outside her apartment on Paris's Rue Saint-Jacques, where she liked to walk her two beloved Belgian Griffon dogs. At Landru's trial later, the prosecution claimed that he first met the heavily indebted Marie in October of 1918 after she advertised to sell her furniture. Circumstantial evidence suggests that he may have encountered her several years earlier in another town, but that was never proven. And then after he got with her, she came up missing. Now, Landru was able to avoid capture during the war for three main reasons. One was the war itself, which it kept the police force busy, and officers of military aid were mobilized and sent to the forefront of the battle rather than doing local police work. In Vernquille, where Landru rented his first house from December 1914 to August 1915, there was just one constable, which is like the police officer, um, and he was in his early 70s. He was stationed in the village, and one single mountain gendarme, which is also like a police officer, who is located in the market town 4 miles away. The second reason he avoided capture so well is that his wife and 4 children knew his whereabouts throughout the war but shielded him from the police. Landru's youngest son, Charles, was born in 1900. He worked as his self-styled apprentice, helping Landru remove furniture and other possessions from at least 5 of the known victims' apartments, and latterly acting as his father's chauffeur. So he drove his father around and helped collect belongings of Landru's victims. He made his children accomplices. His oldest son, Maurice, who was born in 1894, was brought into the schemes in the summer of 1915, but he was arrested soon afterwards for various frauds and thefts, including the receipt and sale of valuables from Landru that had belonged to his first known victim, Jeannie Couchet. Following his release from prison, Maurice helped Landru concoct a cover story to explain the disappearance of his sixth known victim, Anna, and to one of Anna's friends, he would lie about her whereabouts. So he was covering for his dad. Meanwhile, Landru's wife lived for most of the war in northwestern Paris in the suburb of Clichy under a false name of Fremiette, which was one of Landru's aliases in the ads that we were talking about earlier. She lived in an apartment where he was seen coming and going more regularly now than prior. Now that he's got all these victims and he's like hiding from the law, but he has nowhere else to go to hide, really. He's been, and he needed help with his crimes, so he enlisted his sons and his wife. He would come and go at regular intervals. His wife forged the signature of his eighth known victim, Celestine, so that he could gain access to her bank account. He had his wife impersonate his ninth known victim, Louise, for the same purpose, to get into the bank account. And the third reason why he was able to avoid arrest for so long was that he benefited from the indifference of police officers and village officials to the fate of the women. Like, people didn't give a shit that they were missing. They didn't honestly even look into it enough to believe that they were missing. So they're grown women. If they want to move away, they can move away. Because the aliases were different, it didn't seem like they disappeared while dating the same person as each other. They really didn't care about the fate of women at a time when hundreds of thousands of young men were losing their lives at the war front. It's arguable that Landru might never have been arrested without the persistence of yet another woman who forced the authorities pretty much to investigate the suspicious man who rented this villa apartment outside of Gambase. Marie Lacoste. Marie Lacoste was the younger half-sister of Celestine, who, she was unmarried, she was a housemaid, she disliked Landru, which his alias at the time was George Fremiette. She didn't like him from the minute that she saw him, and she met him at Celestine's apartment in the summer of 1915. Now, over the next 2 years, Lacoste began to suspect that Celestine's fiance was a marriage swindler that was out to get his hands on her savings, and she was naive, and her friend knew it. So Lacoste's suspicion was confirmed during a visit with her friend, when her friend admitted that he had taken charge of her investments. Celestine refused to take Lacosse's advice to end the engagement, and then the two siblings were hardly on speaking terms when they returned to Paris, and a day later, Landru took Celestine back to Gambius, and on that one-way train ticket that he had bought, and she had never been seen again. So during the autumn of 1917, Landru became increasingly worried that Lacoste might suspect him of her murder, and he tried to reassure her that her half-sister was still alive by sending her two fake postcards, supposedly from her half-sister, but she wasn't falling for it. She instantly knew that they were forgeries, that they were not her half-sister's writing. Like, she knew her sister's writing, and so that was just an extra reason for her to not believe him. Landru continued to be a little bit paranoid because of this. She knew that the signatures were forgeries, but she concluded that Landru was a con man. She didn't take any other actions at that time. She was worried that Landru turned up alone on several occasions to her workplace to invite her to dinner with Celestine, but she was already dead. So basically, he was trying to lure her to the apartment so he could get rid of her half-sister as well, but she would not go because she absolutely could not stand him, and eventually she told Landru to get lost, not to come back, and for the next year, Lacoste mentally washed her hands of her half-sister, deciding that her half-sister was too ashamed about falling into the clutches of a crook to want any further contact between them. But then in December 1918, Lacoste received a letter which stirred her into action. Celestine's son had been blinded during the war, and from his home in the southwest France, he tried to contact his mom to borrow some money following what he called a serious accident, and she didn't reply. So he then contacted his mom's half-sister, who was wondering why would her half-sister not reply to her son. So she tried to get a hold of her herself and realized that she had been last seen at her apartment the summer of 1917, which is over a year before, and that at least one other woman had subsequently spent the night at her apartment, according to neighbors who saw people coming and going from there before he paid off the lease. So then she became alarmed. She concluded that her half-sister was probably killed, and probably by Landru, and that's when she realized that he had probably been planning to kill her as well. That's why he kept inviting her over. So she made a file. She wrote everything down into a neat little fucking file and brought it to the police. And she also wrote down Landru's physical appearance, his known movements since 1915 that she could ascertain, the location and design of his house near Gambais, his thefts from her half-sister's bank accounts, the forged postcards after her disappearance, his phony invitations to dinner, the whole 9 years. And she took all that shit to the police in Paris, and she was accompanied by a fellow maid called Laurie Bonheur, who had seen Landru when he visited the house where they worked, so that she could give like a witness description of the man, because they didn't believe for a second that he was using his real name, and he wasn't. The police officer at the station, when they got there and gave all this information, he tells her, "You need to contact the authorities in Gambais, where she vanished, not here." He didn't want to be bothered. So then she wrote to the mayor, and in her best formal French, forgetting her catch her breath in writing, like periods and commas and shit. It was just all one run-on sentence. "You have in your commune a house at about 100 meters from the church." This is in quotes. This is what she wrote, "which is called the Maison Trique. The name of the owner, I do not know him, but the house was rented in 1917 to a gentleman around 40 years old who had long brown beard, who has his name as Monsieur Fermiette. Therefore, this gentleman lived in this house for a good part of the summer of 1917 with a woman of about 45 to 50, more exactly 47, with blue eyes, chestnut hair, medium height. And the mayor denied any knowledge of Celestine or a man called Fermiette living at the villa. This claim was well short of the truth because the mayor did recognize the man described accurately by Lacoste as another of Landru's aliases, Raoul Dupont. The mayor did, however, put Lacoste in touch with Victorine Pilat, the younger sister of Landru's sixth known victim, Anna Colomb, who made an identical inquiry about Colomb in 1917. Now, the two ladies got together. They had separate investigations. They got together. They filed two missing person complaints with the prosecutor's office in the department where Gambiaso is located. And they went together, and they were not going to back down. And the cases finally wound their way back to Inspector Jules Bellin of Paris Flying Squad, which is the Brigade Mobile. Bellin interviewed Pilat and Lacoste, and then plagiarized most of their research for an internal police report, in which he falsely took all the credit for Landru's arrest, when his capture was entirely... What is that sound? Honey, stop. Sorry about that. His capture was entirely due to a chance sighting of him on the 11th of April 1919 by Lacoste's friend as he was shopping with his mistress, yet another one. And they tried to follow Landru after he left the shop, but they were scared that he would see them following, and so she just ran home and told Lacoste, who phoned Bellin with the news. Bellin retrieved a business card that Landru had left with his alias of Lucien Guillet, Guillet. He had given to a shop assistant and visited the address indicated, and when they showed up there, guess who answered the door? That's right. So, he was arrested, and he had just gotten back from accosting a woman on the metro, so it couldn't have been him. What kind of alibi is that? Well, they arrested him. Okay, thank goodness. It's about damn time. So, from the moment of his arrest, when he refused to confirm his identity, because he refused to give his real name, he had multiple interrogations, 1919 and 1920. He repeatedly said he was innocent, obviously. He demanded to know why he would have killed these women when they were his friends. He demanded to see proof that they were even dead because, according to him, they were alive and well and living their lives with some other man. He was friends with them, he would know. The investigating magistrate was initially confident that he could wrap up the case in a matter of days following the discovery on the 29th of April 1919, where when they did a search they found some tiny fragments of charred human bone debris beneath a pile of leaves in his back garden. However, the material was more problematic than it first appeared because, like I said, it was fragments, and they could not, at that time, DNA and all that shit wasn't around, so they couldn't say whose bone fragments those were, if he's the reason that they were there. But they had a lot of circumstantial evidence, so they had gathered tons of what they called proof, like the stolen financial assets and possessions of the 10 missing women on the list that they had. He kept a lot of the items that he stole from these women, and a lot of the money stashed. They found that. He didn't sell their belongings. He kept them like trophies in hopes he wouldn't need it, but he kept stealing more money from other people, so by doing that, he didn't need to spend as much of their things. Plus, he was a little bit paranoid that if he sold the stolen goods, that it would come to light that they came from somebody who was disappeared. Um, they had a trial. During the trial, they established that um, the debris that they found in his garden did come from at least three or more skeletons, but they didn't know if those skeletons were female. There were no pelvic bones, and they didn't have the forensics that they have these days. They just somehow could tell that they came from three or more women, and they stated that the bone fragments came from three or more of the missing women. Now, there was a time during the trial where Landru's defense attorney made them think for a second. He said, oh, it couldn't have been theirs because, well, we got them coming in right now through that back door back there to show you that they are alive and well. And everybody turned to look at the door except for Landru. Landru didn't look because he knew nobody was coming in that damn thing. But the point that they were trying to make was, you don't know for sure that they're dead, because if you did, you wouldn't have looked to watch them come into the door. That's where he was trying to go with that. And according to the defense attorney, he believed that Landru was innocent. He believed that he could prove it, and this was one of the ways. But he was unable to do that. He was found guilty on all charges. His wife and son, one of his sons, were arrested as well, but they were eventually let go because there was no proof that they actually had helped him. They couldn't get Landru to admit that he enlisted his family members to help him, and they really had no proof. So they did find some jewelry and such from each of the victims in his possession. He said it was all gifts, but ultimately he was found guilty and he was sentenced to die. And at the time, the method of the death penalty there was the guillotine, which is, if you don't know, it's a large entrapment with a huge blade on it. They stick his head in there and the blade drops, boom, head off, and that's that. Personally, my guess is there would be zero pain, very quick and easy, and they should probably bring that back. That's just my opinion. But, you know, that's neither here nor there. He was put to death, but beforehand, usually they shave the person before they are put to death. They also cover their eyes, put a head mask over, and walk them out. He had two final requests. One was to not shave his beard, and at first that was denied, but he was able to talk the guards into not shaving it. Don't know how, but I guess he was a very persuasive person, obviously, so he got his way there. And he wanted a foot soak and massage beforehand, which he did receive. And then he was led out. There was a huge crowd. All the local residents showed up to watch as he was put to death. I think they said it took less than a minute and a half from the time he was led out of the building, the jail building, and from that time to the time his head was in the basket, minute and a half. So they didn't fuck around. And the only words he stated that he was innocent, that they were making a mistake, and then as they did put the hood over him and get him on his knees and put his head in where it needed to be, and he said, "I will be brave." And then he was gone. And they did bury his body, but not his head. But his family refused to pay for the taxes on the plot, so they dug him up and then moved him to an unmarked grave in the prison, outside the prison. His head is on display to this day in a museum, and I will post the information there because I don't have it written in front of me. But that part to me is a little bit creepy, that they have his head mounted for everybody to see still after all this time. if I was a superstitious person, or a number of other different terms, you would think that the head and the body should be buried together so they could rest in peace. But honestly, I couldn't give two shits if he resting in peace or not. He took out at least 11 people, probably far more than 11. Um, he screwed over pretty much everybody he came in contact with. So if he's having a hell of a time on the other side, so be it. And that is all I have to say about that.